When Viking warriors claimed victory, the battle was only half the horror. The true nightmare began after the swords fell silent for the wives of the defeated. Enslaved, violated, or sacrificed, their suffering was buried beneath tales of Norse glory. This is the untold story the sagas refuse to speak, the fate of the women left alive when their husbands died. The sky was the color of iron, bruised, cold, and heavy with smoke. The last screams had faded, leaving only the low crackle of burning roofs and the wet hiss of dying fires. Ravens gathered like omens, circling above the battlefield where the dead still steamed in the frost. The Viking warriors moved among the corpses with the calm of men harvesting a field they had sown. To them, war was a season, and today they reaped its bounty. But victory was not measured only in the blood of men. For every warrior slain, there was a woman left standing, trembling among the ruins, her face smeared with ash, her voice lost to fear. They clutched the bodies of their husbands, fathers, and sons, refusing to let go even as Viking hands pried them apart. Their villages were no longer theirs. Their gods had abandoned them. They belonged now to the conquerors. The Norsemen saw no crime in this. To them, such spoils were owed to the brave. A fallen enemy's wife was a trophy, proof of triumph and strength. The law of the sword ruled all, and the sword had spoken. Some women were dragged by their hair, others herded like livestock toward the ships, their tears met with laughter. A few resisted, cursing their captors in languages foreign to Norse ears. For that, they were silenced with the blunt end of an axe. The chieftain, his beard stained with soot and blood, raised his arm for quiet. His men fell still. From his belt hung the amulet of Thor, gleaming in the firelight. He surveyed the women, the living remnants of the defeated clan, and his voice rang out, low and final. Take what is owed. Burn what is not. And so it began. The men moved through the wreckage like predators among prey. Some selected the youngest and strongest women for the journey north, prizes to display in their longhouses, to bear sons that would never know their fathers' names. The older ones were left behind, their fates sealed in the flames that consumed their homes. Children were spared only to serve. As the longships were loaded, the women looked back one last time to the smoking hills that had once been their world. The air stank of blood and pine, of burnt grain and flesh. Behind them, dogs gnawed at the dead. Ahead, the sea waited, black, cold, endless. That night, the victors feasted beside the shore. They drank mead from curved horns, singing songs of courage and conquest. Their laughter echoed over the waves, carried into the dark. The wives of the slain sat apart, bound together, their eyes reflecting the firelight. Not a word was spoken among them. They were no longer wives, no longer people. They were the spoils of victory, offerings to power, testaments to cruelty. In the morning, the tide rose, and the ships drifted from the shore. Smoke still climbed from the valley like a ghost unwilling to leave. As the coastline shrank behind them, one woman whispered a name that vanished into the wind unheard, unanswered. The Vikings called this glory. History would one day call it horror. The sea carried them north, a convoy of silence broken only by the groan of oars and the cries of gulls. The women huddled together beneath coarse wool cloaks, their wrists bound, their eyes hollow. Every wave felt like a heartbeat of the gods, slow, cold, indifferent. Around them, the Viking warriors laughed and sang, the rhythm of their voices beating like drums of triumph. In Norse law, plunder was sacred. The wealth of the conquered was the reward of the strong, and among the spoils of gold and silver, flesh was counted too. The wives of fallen warriors were catalogued like goods, this one for the chieftain, that one for trade, another for the pleasure of the crew. Their humanity vanished beneath the weight of custom. To a Norseman, conquest was not sin, it was destiny. When the ships reached the northern fjords, the captives were unloaded like cargo. The air bit at their skin. The cold was sharper than memory. The villages that awaited them were carved from stone and ice, places where even the sun seemed a stranger. The women were divided, measured by age, beauty, and strength. The youngest were chosen for the longhouse, the rest sent to labor in the fields or grind grain until their hands bled. Inside the longhouse, the fire burned high, casting shadows on carved wooden walls. The chieftain's wife, a Norse woman with eyes as pale as frost, watched the newcomers with a strange stillness. She said nothing as her husband led one of the captives before the hearth. "She is mine," he declared. The others nodded, their silence a kind of agreement older than law. The captive woman, once a wife herself, stood trembling as the chieftain placed his hand upon her head, not in blessing, but in ownership. She did not cry. She did not beg. Somewhere deep inside, something had already died when her village burned. Now she was a vessel, a breathing relic of a world erased. Days turned into weeks. The women learned the language of command, simple words that meant eat, work, obey. They were fed enough to survive, never enough to live. The men spoke of raids to come, of more villages to burn, more wives to claim. To them, cruelty had no name. It was merely the order of things. At night, the longhouse filled with the sound of feasting. The men's laughter mixed with the crack of bone, the scrape of knives, the dull thud of fists when mead made tempers flare. The women served silently, moving like shadows between firelight and smoke. Sometimes one was summoned to the chieftain's chamber. She would not return until morning, her face empty, her eyes unfocused. Among the captives, whispers began, small, fragile rebellions in the dark. They spoke of gods older than Odin, of spirits that punished men who broke the sacred bond of marriage. But no spirit came. No thunder struck the longhouse roof. The world stayed silent, as if the gods themselves approved of what men had done. And so the women learned to hide their hatred like a spark under ash. They obeyed, they endured, but in the secret places of their hearts, vengeance took root, slow, quiet, waiting. When winter came, the fjord froze, trapping the ships in ice. The warriors called it a gift from Thor. The captives knew better. It was a prison without walls. They had been wives once. Now they were spoils, property of men, owned by the same hands that had destroyed their world. And in the stillness of that endless northern night, they began to understand that death had not been the worst fate after all. The snow fell heavy that winter, blanketing the fjord in silence. The longships sat frozen in place, their dragon-headed prows crusted with ice. Inside the longhouse, the fires burned low, the air thick with smoke and the scent of sweat, fear, and mead. The captives, once the proud wives of warriors, now bore new names, given to them by their masters. Names not of choice, but of convenience. They were no longer women of blood and spirit. They were thralls, living tools. In the Norse tongue, a thrall was neither slave nor servant. She was property bound by oath. From the moment a chieftain or warrior laid claim to her, she became part of his household, marked not by iron but by submission. The men saw no cruelty in it. To them, it was the natural order of the gods. Odin ruled Asgard, men ruled Earth, and women obeyed. Each dawn began with the crack of command. The women rose before the men, tending the fires, fetching water from frozen streams, their hands raw and cracked. Their bodies ached, but no complaint passed their lips. The first lesson of bondage was silence. To speak was to invite the lash or the back of a hand. And so they moved like ghosts through the smoke-filled halls, unseen but always present, the invisible machinery of their master's comfort. One woman, once the wife of a fallen warrior, bore a wound that never healed, a deep scar across her shoulder where her husband's sword had once struck as he tried to defend her. Now the same blade hung above the hearth of the man who owned her. Each morning, as she lit his fire, she stared at it and wondered whether the gods saw her shame. The chieftain, proud and superstitious, often performed oaths over the heads of his thralls. He believed their suffering strengthened his own fortune. When the fire crackled high, he would spill mead onto the floor, muttering words to Odin and Freyr, sealing his luck with their obedience. The women bowed as he spoke, not out of reverence but necessity. Every oath he swore was a reminder that they were bound by forces larger than their chains, by a law written in conquest. Among the thralls, fragments of their old selves survived in secret. They hummed lullabies from their lost homelands while grinding barley, whispered forbidden prayers while mending the warriors' clothes. They shared what scraps of hope they could. But hope was a dangerous thing in a place where survival was measured in obedience. Sometimes at night, the men told tales of their next raid, of fertile lands across the sea, of kings who would fall, of women who would soon wear chains like theirs. The captives listened and understood. The cycle would never end. For every village burned, another longhouse would be filled with silence and submission. One evening, as the blizzard howled outside, a thrall refused to rise when ordered. Her master struck her once, twice, then dragged her to the door and threw her into the snow. No one saw her again. By morning, the drifts had swallowed her body. The warriors called it justice. The women called it mercy. In that frozen season, the wives of the fallen learned what it meant to live as shadows. They cooked, cleaned, served, and obeyed, their spirits bound tighter than any rope. Yet deep inside, beneath the ashes of despair, burned a flicker of defiance. It was not loud nor visible, but it was there, waiting for spring, waiting for a moment when silence could finally scream. Winter deepened like a curse. The snow no longer fell, it ruled. The fjord became a prison of ice, and the wind howled through the valleys like a voice from another world. In the longhouse, the walls groaned beneath frost and memory. The men grew restless, their hunger not only for food but for dominance. The wives of the defeated, now thralls in every sense, endured their masters' moods like a tide they could not fight. The longhouse was both hearth and hell. The central fire pit glowed red, casting long shadows on the carved beams above. Around it, the Norsemen sat, drinking from horned cups, boasting of battles long past. Between them, the women moved silently, their faces hidden beneath veils of ashen hair. Each footstep was measured, each breath a risk. A dropped cup or a spilled drink could awaken fury, and fury meant pain. The chieftain's word was law, and his pleasure was command. When the men grew drunk, they summoned the women to dance, not with music or grace, but as spectacle. Their trembling bodies were another form of entertainment, reminders of conquest turned flesh. The Norsemen's wives watched with faces carved from stone, saying nothing. They had learned long ago that silence was safer than pity. When the night stretched endless, the captives found no refuge in sleep. The creak of the roof timbers mimicked the groan of ships, and every gust of wind sounded like the wailing of ghosts. Some women prayed to their old gods. Others cursed them. They whispered names of lost husbands, lost sons, until even memory began to fade. Grief, they learned, had a limit, but endurance did not. The eldest among them, a woman with white-streaked hair and eyes the color of ash, became their unspoken leader. She had once been a seer's daughter, wise in herbs and omens. Now she served as a cook, stirring cauldrons of broth for her captors. But when the men slept, she whispered to the others of survival, not as submission, but as waiting. Ice breaks, she told them. Even mountains crack. Remember who you were. Her voice became the faint ember that kept them from turning to stone. The youngest, a girl barely 16, bore the worst of the nights. The chieftain had chosen her for himself. Her cries, soft and broken, echoed through the longhouse walls like the sound of something holy being desecrated. None dared intervene. To do so would bring death, or worse, another night in her place. By dawn, she returned to her mat near the fire, her eyes open, unblinking, as if she no longer inhabited her own body. Outside, the world froze solid. Wolves prowled the edges of the settlement, their eyes reflecting the same cold hunger as the men inside. Food grew scarce, tempers shorter. Once, a thrall was accused of stealing a crust of bread. She was dragged to the hearth and branded on her arm, a mark that would never fade. The smell of her burning flesh filled the longhouse, but no one spoke. The fire crackled, indifferent. By the time the first thaw came, the women had learned to wear obedience like armor. They bowed when spoken to, smiled when ordered, and never met a man's eyes for too long. But beneath that quiet submission, something darker had begun to take shape, a shared understanding, a silent pact. They were captives, yes, but not broken. As the rivers began to melt and the ships were readied for sea, the thralls lifted their eyes to the horizon. Somewhere beyond the ice and mist lay freedom or vengeance. The difference no longer mattered. When spring came, it did not bring mercy. It came red, the color of sacrifice. The thawed rivers ran thick with meltwater and ash, and the longhouse stirred to life again. The men prepared for the blot, the sacred offering to the gods. For them, it was a season of renewal. For the captives, it was the season of dread. The blot was older than any written word. It was a promise to the old gods that blood would pay for bounty. The Vikings believed that every victory, every harvest, demanded balance, a life given for a life taken. Cattle, goats, and horses were slaughtered in ritual feasts, their blood smeared on altars, their skulls hung from sacred trees. But when the war had been great, when the gods demanded more, the offerings became human. The women knew this. They could feel it in the way the men grew restless, in the way the chieftain's voice took on the rhythm of prophecy. "The gods have favored us," he said one night, standing before the fire. "We will answer their gift with blood, as our fathers did before us." His men roared in approval, raising their cups high. The captives bowed their heads, praying their eyes would not meet his. Preparations began the next morning. The village gathered near the sacred grove, a circle of ancient oaks darkened by centuries of smoke and prayer. The air there was heavy, almost alive, humming with superstition. Wooden idols of Odin and Freyr stood tall, their carved faces grim and watchful. The ground beneath them was black from old blood, and the wind carried the iron scent of sacrifice. Among the captives, fear rippled like fire through dry straw. The seer's daughter, the old woman who had become their quiet leader, whispered to them as they worked. "The gods they serve are not gods of mercy," she said. "But all gods grow hungry. Even theirs." Her voice trembled, but her gaze held defiance. On the day of the blot, the men wore furs and iron rings. The chieftain's wife adorned the altar with woven branches and stones carved with runes. The drums began, slow, steady, and hollow, echoing like a heartbeat through the trees. The first to be offered were animals. Their blood poured into wooden bowls, splashed upon the altar. The crowd chanted, calling to Odin, to Thor, to Freyr, their words swallowed by the wind. Then came the silence. The chieftain raised his hand. "The gods are not yet full," he said. Two warriors dragged a captive woman from the circle. She struggled, screaming a name no one understood. The crowd did not move. The seer's daughter stepped forward, whispering a prayer in her old tongue, not for mercy, but for remembrance. When the axe fell, the chant resumed, louder than before. Blood sprayed across the snow, dark and steaming, and the crowd roared as though the gods themselves had answered. By nightfall, the fire in the grove burned high. The men feasted again, their faces red from meat and madness. The captives sat apart, their bodies shaking but their faces still. They had seen the truth of the blot. It was not a rite of faith, but of power. The gods were only mirrors of the men who worshipped them, cruel, hungry, and hollow. Later, When the fires died and the grove fell silent, the old woman pressed her hand to the earth where the blood had sunk. "The gods of men take," she whispered, "but the earth remembers." And beneath that cold starlit sky, something ancient shifted, not divine, not merciful, but patient. After the blot, the village reeked of smoke, blood, and satisfaction. But among the survivors, fear had taken root like rock beneath frost. The gods were fed, yet hunger remained. The chieftain's men grew restless once more, drunk on death and victory. They wanted celebration. They wanted possession. And so began the cruelest ritual of all, the mock wedding. It was not a tradition sung by skalds or carved into stones, but whispered among old warriors and kept alive in shadows. When a great battle ended and the men returned with captives, some demanded a ceremony to bind their dominance. They called it the blood wedding, a parody of union, where conquered women were made brides for a single night, only to be discarded by dawn. The chieftain declared it would honor Freyja, goddess of fertility. He claimed it would bless the village with life and abundance, but everyone knew it was not about the gods. It was about ownership, the victory of men over both enemies and women alike. A great hall was prepared. Its beams were still stained with soot from the winter fires, its walls lined with shields and the heads of slain animals. Torches flickered along the stone, throwing wild shadows that danced like spirits. The air was heavy with the smell of ale, sweat, and something darker expectation. The women were brought in, washed and dressed in white linen stolen from the dead. Their hair was braided in haste, their faces powdered with ash to mimic purity. The seer's daughter watched, silent and motionless, her eyes sharp as a blade. She had seen rituals before, but this one carried the stench of madness. When the chieftain entered, the hall fell silent. Behind him followed his warriors, each one choosing a woman as though selecting a weapon. Laughter rose, hollow and cruel. "Tonight," he said, raising his cup, "we unite blood with blood and life will return to the earth." His words dripped with mockery and the hall answered with cheers. One woman, young, terrified, her wrists still bruised from the ropes, was crowned with a wreath of dead flowers. The men called her the Bride of Freya. The chieftain led her to the center of the hall where a carved altar stood. There, before the gods and his men, he recited vows twisted from old rites, promising her freedom in death and honor in his name. Then came the scream. It was sharp, short, and swallowed by the roar of the crowd. The men pounded the tables, singing and shouting, while the women stood frozen, their faces pale ghosts in the torchlight. The ritual that followed blurred the line between celebration and massacre. By dawn, the brides lay silent, their white linen stained red, offerings to gods that no longer listened. When morning broke, the men stumbled out into the cold air, leaving behind a hall thick with death and shame. The chieftain's wife stood at the doorway, her face as unreadable as stone. She had watched it all, her eyes reflecting the firelight, not in horror, but in quiet calculation. She knew something the men did not. Rituals built on blood never stay buried. They return. As the survivors were ordered to clean the hall, the seer's daughter whispered a vow under her breath. "No god will take vengeance," she said softly, her hands shaking but her voice steady. "So I will." That night, while the men slept and the fires dimmed, she gathered what remained of the women's courage. In their grief, she found purpose. In their silence, a plan began to form, one that would turn the cruelty of men upon itself. The blood wedding had ended, but the true reckoning had only just begun. When the snow melted once more, the screams had long been replaced by silence. Months passed, and with them came the cruel consequence of the blood wedding. The women who survived began to change, their bodies swelling with unwanted life, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. What had been taken from them now lived within them. For some, it was a curse. For others, a weapon. In the village, no one spoke of the wedding. The men called it the Feast of Blessings. The priests said it pleased the gods. But when the first of the women gave birth, the air turned cold again. The child was pale, weak, and silent. The midwife, trembling, refused to touch it. The old seer's daughter looked on and whispered, "The gods do not bless what was taken in blood." Some of the women refused to care for the children, seeing in their faces the shadows of their fathers. Others held them with a strange, broken tenderness, not out of love, but defiance. If they came from violence, one said, then they will grow to end it. But most simply watched as the seasons changed, trapped between shame and survival. The chieftain grew uneasy. He had won battles, burned villages, and sacrificed in the name of the gods. But now, whispers followed him like ghosts. Some said the dead wives haunted the longhouse, that their cries could be heard in the wind. Others claimed the children themselves carried a curse. They did not laugh, did not cry, only stared with eyes too knowing for their years. As time passed, the village began to fracture. Crops failed, cattle sickened. The priests demanded more. Sacrifices, more offerings, as though spilling more blood could wash away the old sins. But the women, those who had once been captives, no longer obeyed so easily. They gathered quietly at the river, beneath the watchful moon, their whispers turning into plans. The seer's daughter led them. Her hair had turned gray, but her eyes burned with the calm fury of someone who had already walked through hell. "They gave us death," she said. "We will give them remembrance." She taught the women how to use herbs, not for healing, but for silence. She spoke of poisons made from roots, of prayers that bound words to vengeance. One night, a child, one born of that cursed winter, stood beside her. "Mother," he said softly, though she was not his mother, "will they hurt us again?" She looked down at him, seeing both the monster and the innocent in his face. "No," she whispered. "You will outlive them all." By spring, the first man fell ill. Then another. The priests called it the wrath of Loki, the vengeance of broken spirits. No one noticed that the seer's daughter no longer prayed. She simply watched, silent and patient, as the past devoured the living one by one. The women had been shamed, silenced, enslaved. But now, through their quiet rebellion, they had become something the warriors could never conquer, the living memory of what men chose to forget. And from their wombs, both curse and justice were born. By the time the next winter came, the village had changed. The laughter of warriors no longer filled the nights, and the clang of iron faded into an uneasy quiet. Death had returned, not as war, but as sickness. One by one, the men who had feasted after the blood wedding began to fall. Some coughed blood. Others wandered into the forest and never came back. No one dared speak the truth, but everyone knew. The gods had turned their faces away. The chieftain grew gaunt, his once proud face shadowed by fear. He called upon priests and healers, offering sacrifices that stained the snow crimson. Yet the gods remained silent. Each night, his dreams brought back the same visions. Women in white linen, faces pale beneath wreaths of dead flowers, whispering his name through the smoke. When he woke, the fire always burned low, as if the air itself refused to keep him warm. The seer's daughter walked through the village like a ghost. No one stopped her now. Some said she carried death in her breath. Others swore she spoke to the spirits of the wronged. She did not deny it. Instead, she visited the graves, shallow mounds of frozen earth marked by crude stones, and whispered to them as though feeding them secrets. The women followed her in silence. They brought no torches, no offerings, only remembrance. Beneath the cold moonlight, they laid small tokens, locks of hair, torn ribbons, drops of blood onto the graves. Not to mourn, but to bind. Each act was a quiet defiance, a prayer that the past would not be forgotten again. The chieftain's wife, once silent and watchful, began to see what her husband could not. The sickness was not born of the body, but of the soul. "You built your house on blood," she told him one night, her voice calm. "Now it sinks beneath it." He struck her for her words, but when he turned away, he saw her eyes, steady, almost pitying. It was then he understood that fear had finally come for him. When his eldest son fell ill, the chieftain sent word to the neighboring clans for help. None came. The warriors who once boasted of his power now whispered of curses and divine retribution. His village became a graveyard of iron and silence. Smoke no longer rose from the forges. The feasts had ended. Even the ravens avoided the rooftops. The seer's daughter came to his hall one final time. She did not kneel or beg. She simply looked at him, the man who had ruled through terror and ritual, and said, "The gods you served were born from your cruelty. Now they are fed by it." He called her witch, cursed her name, and ordered her death. But no man moved. His warriors stared at him with empty eyes, too tired, too haunted to obey. She turned and left without a word. The next morning, the chieftain's hall burned. Some said he had set it himself, driven mad by guilt. Others whispered that the spirits of the slain brides had returned to finish what the living began. When the smoke cleared, only ashes remained. The village that had once celebrated conquest now lay silent beneath the snow, its graves marked not by stone, but by memory. The wind that swept through the valley carried no songs, only the faint echo of women's voices, chanting in a tongue older than vengeance. In the end, there was no glory left, only ruin, silence, and the slow burial of everything once called divine. When the fires of the chieftain's hall died out, the wind carried away the last cries of the village. The valley fell into a stillness that felt almost sacred, a silence not of peace, but of exhaustion. The war had ended long ago, yet its ghosts remained, whispering through the empty longhouses and snow-covered graves. The age of men who called themselves gods was gone. Only the echoes of their cruelty endured. The surviving women gathered near the river, their faces drawn but unbroken. They had outlasted the warriors, the priests, even the storms. What remained of the village was theirs now, the forges cold, the altars abandoned, the gods forgotten. The seer's daughter stood among them, her hands trembling from age but her gaze sharp as winter light. She looked over the ruins and spoke softly, "The gods took what they were given. But we take nothing. We remember." The children of that cursed winter played nearby, unaware of the weight they carried. Some bore the faces of their fathers, others the quiet fury of their mothers. The women watched them, torn between sorrow and hope. For the first time in years, there was no fear of the men returning, no drunken laughter echoing through the night. Only the steady sound of the river, washing away what it could, though memory, unlike blood, never fully cleansed. Seasons passed, and the world beyond the valley changed. Traders stopped coming. The paths grew wild again. The old gods were forgotten, replaced by new names and gentler prayers. But in that valley, beneath layers of snow and silence, something older lingered. The graves of iron lay beneath moss and frost, their stories untold to any skald or priest. No saga would sing of the blood wedding or the women who rose from its ashes. History preferred the victors, and the victors were long dead. The seer's daughter lived to see another spring. She no longer spoke of vengeance or the gods, only of silence. Some nights she would sit by the fire, whispering to the flames as though speaking to someone unseen. "There was no justice," she would say. "Only memory. And sometimes that is enough." When she finally passed, the women buried her not in the village, but near the river where the blood of sacrifice had once flowed. They marked her grave with no stone, only a woven circle of reeds. The wind carried her ashes across the valley, into the forests, into the mountains. Some said the land itself sighed, as if releasing a long-held breath. Years turned into generations. The village became a ruin, swallowed by earth and time. Travelers who crossed the valley spoke of strange quiet, a silence so deep that even the birds refused to sing. Some claimed they saw pale figures in the mist, walking along the riverbank at dusk. Others heard faint voices, women's voices carried on the wind, not crying, not pleading, but remembering. In the end, the story of the Viking wives was never written in stone or song. It survived only in whispers, in the rustle of leaves, in the hush that followed thunder, in the quiet dread that lingered where cruelty once ruled. The world moved on, as it always does, but the silence endured. And within that silence lived the truth, that power built on blood always drowns in it, and that even forgotten women can shape the ghosts of history. The gods had demanded sacrifice, and men had obeyed. But it was the women who remained silent, scarred, and eternal. The storm had passed. What lingered was not peace. It was remembrance.